I'm Joan Young. This session on Indigenous inclusion is called Building Community. Shared memories as building blocks. We cannot build community without a common sense of our history, our shared story. I would like to acknowledge that the land I am sharing this from is Treaty 7 territory in southern Alberta, Canada, home of the Blackfoot people, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda. I'm grateful to live among them. As a descendant of European immigrants, I did not grow up near a First Nation, nor did I encounter an Indigenous person till I was 19. Our worlds were that far apart. My first encounter and subsequent decades of interaction with Blackfoot people was facilitated by my membership in the Bahá'í community. In that context, I was able to follow others who had established connections and begin to develop my own. In the 1960s and 70s, there were few places in Canada for our two peoples to come together, but the Bahá'í community was one. My first visit to a felt nation felt like being on another continent, one in which I sensed spiritual power and presence, but also a great deal of mystery. My young self knew there was much to learn, but both my background and my faith encouraged me to help them bring something to them. It took decades to understand that it may be more important to learn than to attempt to deliver programs to people I knew little about. Trust and relationships with individuals were established over time, but it was not until decades had passed and common memories with individuals were created that friendships truly flourished. Memories such as reminiscing about the time we had tea with their grandmother, or a powwow we both attended, or picnics we were both at, bonded us more deeply and more closely together. The Guardian commented on trying to change or improve Indigenous people. In a letter written on his behalf to an Australian believer in 1955, he said, "The Guardian thinks perhaps a different approach to the Aborigines might attract them, one of being interested in their lives and their folklore, and of trying to become their friend, right, rather than trying to change or improve them." Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner Murray Sinclair said we need to be in the process of reconciliation for the long haul, not just for quick performative gestures. Along with systemic change, personal relationships are an indispensable aspect of reconciliation. It requires spending time together and sharing stories. My friendships with First Nations people were furthered when I began to collect stories, which resulted in the eventual publication of my book, In the Cathedral of the Plains. I had the opportunity to listen at times while traveling together or in each other's homes, and it was lovely. I called on Blackfoot Bahá'í Beverly Knowlton, who grew up at Piikani First Nation, to be a cultural sensitivity reader. Working with her was not only profoundly educating, but deepened our friendship. At times, it was seemingly small, simple points she observed that would inform me in a much bigger way. She said my description of a ceremony during a drought in the 1960s, which I called a rain dance, was a Hollywood movie term, not one her people would use. It caused me to wonder what else I may have absorbed of Hollywood's language that I might not be aware of. Not only did the moment illustrate my culture's skewed portrayal of First Nations, it taught me about the subtleties of translating words into a language where the thing doesn't even exist. There were other moments when I was struck by how different the worldviews of our two cultures are. and yet how common so much human experience is. An example of the difference was a day a Blackfoot friend and I were making little giveaway gifts for an event, and they included pieces of wild sage. When we were finished, I scooped up the leftover bits off my table, dropped them in the garbage, and she said, "But Joan, sage is sacred. You don't throw it in the garbage can." On another occasion, I'd collected cedar for a giveaway, and we were tying it into little bundles. And she asked, "Did you remember to put something back on the earth?" It hadn't entered my mind to do so. Yet not long before that, I had written the story of an elderly woman who said that when she was little, her mother would take her picking berries and would say to her, "Now, the first berry you pick, don't eat it. Put it on the ground so more berries grow next year." I missed that. So, an example of our common human experience and the hospitality of one particular Indigenous woman was demonstrated early in my Baha'i life when I attended a picnic that the people at Begani had organized. It invited a bunch of us urban Baha'is too. I arrived with my infant son and asked the woman whose home we were at where I could change my baby's diaper. She said, "Oh, bring him into my bedroom and change him on my bed." It was such a lovely gesture of kindness of one generation of mother to another. She engaged me in conversation, and I will always be grateful to her. Non-Indigenous people like me were the product of an education that barely acknowledged First Nations' presence on the land before we came, and gave us next to no understanding of their experience of history or their ways of being. As an African proverb says, "Until lions learn to write, the history of the hunt will always be written by the hunter." We were given the history of our land by the colonial hunter. Recently, I came across a quote from George Erasmus, which struck me as a clear articulation of the need to hear Indigenous people's stories. In the book Reconciling History, A Story of Canada by Jody Wilson-Raybould and Roshan Dinesh, Erasmus shares his statement saying, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created." The formation of community rooted in justice and respect, resulting in unity, is of critical interest to the Baha'is, whose guidance from the Universal House of Justice in 2021 states that their work means learning how to raise up vibrant, outward-looking communities. It means those communities learning how to bring about spiritual and material progress. It means learning how to communicate to the discourses, contribute to the discourses that influence the direction of that progress. A vibrant, outward-looking community requires a deep and loving connection between members of different cultural backgrounds, not only between members who share a similar past. People with the same background and foundational stories have that common memory that Erasmus refers to. They shared similar childhoods. They may have gone to the same schools. Excuse me. And upon meeting each other, they may, and recognizing a name, they may say, "Oh, are you related to so-and-so?" Feelings of commonality create immediate connection, upon which friendship is easily built. When individuals reminisce about something they did together, it often ends in joyful laughter. ties between them are deepened by sharing that. Feelings of commonality create immediate connection. Common memory includes origin stories, how our community came to be. When we do not share common memory, it needs to be built through the sharing of stories. Other people's experience becomes part of our memory as well, and our appreciation and understanding of them grows. Jody Wilson-Raybould used the term silos in speaking of the different experience of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canadian society. Consider how little traffic has occurred between them, how little going back and forth carrying friendship and learning has occurred. To be fair, in the past we lived largely in separate geographic locations, but that was by design in the building of Canada. Indigenous people were moved to increasingly shrinking pockets of land and not even allowed to leave the reserves without approval from an Indian agent until the 1940s or later in some places. According to the National Association of Friendship Centers, as of 2021, 61% of Indigenous people in Canada now live in urban centers, demonstrating that our communities are not so much separated by geography, but by cultural and racial considerations. When it comes to the Baha'i community in particular, I wonder, are there silos in it too? The Canadian Baha'i community is composed of three main groups: Indigenous people, people of European descent, and Persians. The Baha'i community's greatest periods of growth occurred in three distinct waves. Prior to the 1960s, there were only about 500 Baha'is in Canada, all of whom were descendants of white European immigrants. Though there was the beginning of an Indigenous community in Tyendinaga, beginning in 1958, a huge wave of First Nations people on the prairies began to enter the faith. In Alberta, it was Arthur and Lillian Irwin who, through friendships with people at Bigani, opened the doors to a flood of First Nations enrolling in the following decade. Arthur made contact with the people through his work as a geologist working for the federal government, checking on potential petroleum seeps at Bigani Nation. His friendship with a local guide led to meeting the guide's friends and establishing regular prayer and fireside meetings. In Saskatchewan, it was Angus Cowan, along with a few others, who opened the doors for large numbers of First Nations to enter the community. By 1963, of the 1,500 enrolled Baha'is in Canada, a full third of them were First Nations. And I'd just like to point out in the picture here, in the center top picture, is the first elected spiritual assembly of the Baha'is at Bigani, which includes two white friends who lived there. There's Samson Knowlton, one of the early well-known Baha'is, on the right in regalia. Also Samson on the far left, being a delegate at the 1966 National Convention. Beside him is Harvey Iron Eagle, a Saskatchewan Baha'i. The second wave of enrollments came in the 1970s with the enrollment of large numbers of youth. The National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Canada reported that at the height of the proclamation to youth, in 1971, the annual increase in membership reached 50%. Something happened to the Baha'is themselves as they made the effort which the 9-year plan required. The rock band Jalal undertook a 9-month tour, which attracted large numbers of young people. They were very cool, I remember. There were also was also a multi-purpose media team who traveled, and I encountered them in Saskatoon. Indeed, that's where I said, is there a way to join this faith? Can I do that? By the 1980s and the onset of the Iranian Revolution, hundreds of Iranians arrived. A program of settlement in cooperation with Canadian immigration authorities was so successful in integrating these newcomers that the Director General of Operations for Refugee Affairs, Jerry Van Kessel, commented that his work with the Baha'i program had been a highlight in his career. Communities across the country, both large and small, welcomed the arrivals and helped them gain a footing. The Persian newcomers became well established in the community. Here's a couple of Persian friends of mine, though they didn't come at that time. In fact, they had moved to Sweden from Iran many years before. We're sharing stories at lunch, speaking of stories. And the woman on the left actually lives in Sweden. She was a well-known representative at United Nations organizational things in Europe. Her name is Mary Afsahi, and her daughter is a good friend of mine on the right, May Cummings. In this presentation, I'm focusing primarily on First Nations Bahá'ís and their experience of Bahá'í community as shared with me. One individual said, I don't feel very comfortable at big meetings. Nobody talks to me. Another explained, I brought my teenage granddaughters to a holy day and the Persian youth stood in a tight circle, my girls nearby, nobody talked to them, and afterwards when their dad picked them up and said, well, did you make any friends? What could they say? They actually tried one more time attending an event and the same thing happened, so they gave up. This lack of interaction occurred in an urban community. But out on a First Nation, in earlier years, an elderly Blackfoot Baha'i told me about going out to attend a feast and taking a white friend with her. The feast had barely begun when the white friend said, this isn't how you do a feast. According to my friend, it was the last 19-day feast that community arranged on its own initiative. Worldview is how we see things. Culture shapes worldview. Culture tells people what the appropriate greetings are, what kind of physical contact is appropriate, who we make eye contact with, how children should behave, how we should treat the elderly, even what activities might be seen as spiritual. It affects what we see as correct behavior, its speech and dress, how we come to group decisions, and how readily we dominate conversations to influence the path of group action. To think that our belief in Baha'u'llah insulates us from what could be called colonial thinking is mistaken. Colonialism, the practice of imposing the will of one people on another, is embedded in the very fabric of our country. Indigenous people continue to have to fight in the courts for basic services and rights that the rest of us simply take for granted. The purpose of the Baha'i Revelation is to transform the individual and society. So is it only other people who need to be transformed? Have we no traces of unconscious superiority left? The Guardian said, let the white make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of the problem, to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, to correct their tendency towards revealing a patronizing attitude towards members of the other race, to persuade them through their intimate, spontaneous, and informal association with them of the genuineness of their friendship and the sincerity of their intentions, and to master their impatience of any lack of responsiveness on the part of a people who've received for so long a period such grievous and slow healing wounds. Though he was speaking of the black and white races in America, I cannot imagine that his sentiments applied to those races only. And it is this unconscious sense of superiority that we must become conscious of through vigorous self-reflection. When former House of Justice member Ali Naqshbani visited Vancouver in 1996, he asked the First Nations people he met to help us, rather than telling them how we could help them. He listened carefully and at length. According to Roshan Danesh, before his meeting, he sought out knowledge on how to be respectful and how to communicate meaningfully with an understanding of history. I have learned from First Nations Baha'i friends to offer a gift of tobacco when I ask Indigenous people for knowledge or invite them to speak at an event. To them, tobacco is a sacred plant, more often used in conscious gestures of gratitude than it is smoked. I've also learned that when attending their events, I should accept all offers of food or anything else that might be offered to me. And I'm reminded to do so every time I attend an event with a Blackfoot friend. Perhaps their experience of non-Indigenous people's sense of superiority explains part of this need to accept all gifts offered now. It demonstrates an honorable exchange and our willingness to be part of it. The late Lakota Baha'i Kevin Locke and his white friend Chris Buck talk about two-eyed seeing, a way of looking at things from both the Western perspective and the Indigenous one. In an interview, one of them said, "Fairly recently, I've come to understand that our way of working together may have a name, two-eyed seeing. Two-eyed seeing seeks to integrate Indigenous and Western knowledges by taking the best that the two worlds have to offer. The two eyes, when seeing together, enrich and complete each other." This is why I think Abdu'l-Baha and his tablets of the Divine Plan stress the importance of Indigenous perspective as the missing puzzle piece in the fulfillment of the Creator's grand design and purpose in creating and nurturing Grandmother Earth and expressing it in the form of this remarkable prophecy. He said, "Attach great importance to the Indigenous population of America. Likewise, these people, should they be educated and guided, there can be no doubt that they will become so illumined as to enlighten the whole world. If we do not understand and appreciate these people who have the capacity to enlighten the whole world, we may need two eyes to see it. If we do not understand, how can we be trusted? How can we be befriended? How can other people hear the guidance of Baha'u'llah's revelation from people they neither know nor trust? How can societal transformation that we are called upon to effect come about without them being part of it? We need to become in-betweeners, which is the term Roshan Danesh used in his writing on reconciliation. I understand in-betweeners to be those who have the willingness and courage to put themselves in unfamiliar spaces and do the work of sustained relationship building. Here's a slide of Bev Knowlton and me at a walk for survivors of the 60s scoop. Here's a slide of my son-in-law and my friend Bev Knowlton's son on a beach in Haifa, Israel, sharing stories. It made my son-in-law want to come to Canada and share some of what Mal told him. Here we have early in-betweeners at Bahá'í Nation, Samson Knowlton and Hassan Belyuzi, a hand of the cause, in 1962. With the encouragement of Earl Healy, Reggie Newkirk, in the top corner there, learned men's powwow dancing. Reggie's a man who, from Brooklyn, New York. But Earl said, no, you can do this. You just have to be properly instructed and initiated. So below is his mentor, Mal Cabiosai, on Reggie's right. Reggie's the man leaning forward in the orange shirt. Early Bahá'ís, Samson and Rosie Knowlton. In addition to the love of Baha'u'llah, it is personal connection and friendship that engenders the desire and confidence to actively participate in Baha'i community. And they were a wonderful example. Referring to the importance of friendship, Rosie Knowlton once said, the white Baha'is would visit in our homes. They became friends. Most white people wouldn't come to our homes. It was sustained personal friendship that not only drew her and people like her into lifelong association with the Baha'is, but also to active promotion of its teachings. The author of Secret Life of Bees said, stories have to be told or they die. And when they die, we can't remember who we are or why we're here. It is in the exchange of deeply felt stories and having them heard by a receptive ear that something wonderful happens. Experience is validated, trust is built, and relatedness develops. Tenderness results. Abdu'l-Baha spoke of tenderness when he set the following high bar for us, saying, when any souls grow to be true believers, they will attain a spiritual relationship with one another and show forth a tenderness which is not of this world. Pleasant greetings at feasts alone do not accomplish tenderness. Even working together in service of our faith won't do it, unless it's accompanied by meaningful sharing that results in loving connection. An example of tenderness sustained over years is vividly illustrated in the stories of Rúhíyyih Khánum visiting Bahá'í First Nation. Her first visit was in 1960, and there was an account in the Baha'i News at the time which said, when Rúhíyyih Khánum was seated, head chief John Yellowhorn, Councillor Pat Bad Eagle, and Councillor Joshua Crowshoe entered and were introduced. Rúhíyyih Khánum, in addressing the gathering, spoke of her early and continued interest in the Indian people, and that she had been to the United States and been with the Hopi Indians. She told them that the Indians have a great destiny and indicated that civilization had a great need for that. Then Councillor Crowshoe asked that all the people go outside so they might give her a special name. The two eldest councillors stood on either side of her there, and as the sun came out from behind a cloud, Councillor Crow Eagle raised his right hand and called out in the language of his people for the Great Spirit to come and give this lady a holy name. He named her Natuoxist, which means Blessed Mother. One of the visitors attending the meeting said, "This has been one of the most memorable days of my life, to hear her address the chief and councillors as if they were kings." Her visit on that memorable day in 1960 is still spoken of at Bahá'í by those who were there as a highlight in their lives. Samson Knowlton, in whose home the gathering occurred, said he considered Rúhíyyih Khánum's visit the most significant part of his life as a Baha'i. Her presence, reverence, and respect, as well as her repeated follow-up letters and messages thereafter, made an unforgettable impact. Following her third visit in 1986, she wrote back to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Bahá'ís of Canada saying, "I need not tell you what a profound experience the pipe ceremony on the Pagan reservation was. It was probably the most moving thing that has happened to me in my whole trip, and one of the most moving things that has happened to me in my whole life." In the years that followed, she wrote numerous letters and cards back to people she met. Upon hearing of the passing of Rosie Knowlton in 1981, she sent a handwritten card to Rosie's husband, Samson. She not only sympathized with his loss, but referred back to the day she met him in 1960 with tenderness and regard. The message said, "Dear Samson, through Jamie Bond, I heard of the death of dear Rosie and want to write to express my loving sympathy. When we have been together for a lifetime, separation is very hard, as I well know. My visit in your home in Pagan so long ago and the giving of my name, Natuoxist, is always fresh in my memory, and one of the great events of my life. So many times I have spoken of it in many countries around the world. If there is anyone there who still remembers me, please give them my warm greetings. To them and your family, my love, Rúhíyyih." Tenderness. Just hearing a story can induce feelings of tenderness, provide a sense of identity, impart wisdom, and create pathways for relationship. Here, in the 1960s, we have ceremonialist Pat Bad Eagle holding a young white friend's child in a name-giving ceremony. There is tenderness in his very eyes. I believe we need to create spaces in which such stories can be more frequently shared. Evenings in homes, stories at community events, recorded stories in video and other formats. It will help us decolonize. Kevin Locke said the Lakota term for the word decolonize meant to return to being a human being. One who has been transformed and is restored into a civilized, cultured human being. We will be richer for it and more tender of heart. We will even change the degree of welcome and inclusion in our communities.